a video podcast really worth it in 2025? Because it takes me 40 times longer to film and record my video podcast compared to my audio podcast. So therefore, it also costs me a ton of extra money. But yet, so many people are saying that video is the future, video's king, content's still king, and you need to invest in video in 2025, otherwise you're just going to be left behind. So the question is it worth the effort and the time and the money? This video is all about me letting you know everything that I've learned about video podcasting in the last year or so, my experience with my podcast, and helping you decide whether you think it's worth the time, effort and money to invest in video podcasting this year. So when I first started No Bullshit Talks, my video podcast, I started it back on Zoom back in the day. And that was just because it was the easy thing to do. I was new to podcasting. I didn't really know much about the setup. And I just thought, do you know what? People are familiar with Zoom. It's very easy to set up. I will go for that. Nowadays, there's some absolutely fantastic other bits of remote software like Riverside, which are a better option than Zoom. And they're great for recording podcasts. But I do think that anyone who wants to start a video podcast, this is a great way to go, as in remote video podcast, because it's low budget, it's low key, it's very easy to manage and much easier to edit as well when it comes to the editing process. And you just can go up and running for a very low budget and very quickly compared to with an in-person one. So I would highly recommend that. The thing is, I started to do quite well with the podcast and I really wanted to upgrade it. And I do think that in-person podcast looks so much better. Now, please do go to my season 1 of No Bullshit Talks and compare it to season 2 and let me know what you think and tell me that season 2 doesn't look so much better. But I have invested a ton of money, a ton of time, a ton of effort, and all the stress and blood, sweat and tears that gone into it to make it look as good as it does today. The question is, has that been worth it? Well, let me talk to you about the process first. So I obviously upgraded this year from season 1 to season 2 because I wanted to take it to the next level. I thought that better production quality would mean that I could attract better guests. And I think there is something to this because when I provide video assets to my guests, they look amazing. So let's talk about what I did to try and set that up. So I was completely new to video. I didn't really know anything about it. I had to research it all myself. And so I didn't even know what equipment to buy. But I'm fairly happy with my setup. Don't get me wrong, it's very different to a lot of people out there, but I'm gonna let you know what I've done to set up my podcast. So if you tuned into No Bullshit Talks, first of all, thank you for supporting it and I hope you do enjoy it. And if you haven't, do take a look so you can understand what I'm talking about. But essentially I have 3 cameras on my setup. I have one wide angle on both myself and the speaker. Then I have one each on myself and my guest. And so I can then have the close-up shots and I can have the wide angle and I just interchange between the shots. So therefore it's a nice variety, keeps people interested in the shots. So each of those cameras are shot with a Sony a6400, which shoots in 4K. So those cameras cost about $1,000 each, without any fancy lenses. I did buy some additional lenses for different situations, and I'm gonna cover all of this in more detail in a separate video, so don't worry about that now. This is just an initial thing so you can understand rough costs, so you can understand budgeting for setting up an in-person video. Then I have lights. So I have these softbox lights that go around the room to kind of soften it up and make it look nice. And so those lights cost around £200 to £300, depending on which ones you get. And the same with the microphones. You need good quality microphones to pick up that audio so they sound really crisp. And bear in mind, it's a podcast. So whilst lots of people are watching it on Spotify or on YouTube, people are just also listening to it when you're out. So you really, really need good audio. So I invested in good audio and those microphones cost around £300 as well. And then on top of that, you need to get good tripods. You need to get like additional battery packs. There's all sorts of different things in that. So all in all, my total setup cost around $4,000 to $5,000 for everything. And that, I don't know if that sounds like a lot of money to you or not that much money to you, but that was a lot of money to me. As a small business, bear in mind, this is not a money-making venture that I'm doing. Podcasts take a lot of time to monetize. Luckily, we are starting to get sponsors for season 3 now, but most people who are watching this are probably not going to have that in place, and they're looking for whether they can even afford to do this. So I spent 4 to 5K, and that's probably on the low end of things. You absolutely can do it at the lesser end, and you could have fewer cameras, for example, and you don't have to shoot in 4K, so some of those cameras can be a little bit cheaper, but I think that the quality is really important. So for me, it was like, if I'm going to invest in doing this properly, then I'm going to invest properly. That's what it costs, about 4 to 5K. And the question is that worth investing in? Well, it all depends on what your goals are. If you're just starting out with a podcast, I probably wouldn't do it because it takes so much longer. Like I said, it takes 40 times longer for me to record and edit the podcast by video than it does to audio. So why would anyone do that? Well, the thing is, video has a clear advantage and the fact that it's much more visual and impactful. So when you're sharing the clips on social media platforms, you're likely to catch more interest and spread more awareness about your podcast. Plus, if you've got guests for the podcast, they much prefer it because they're able to have assets that they can use on their social media channels, and they're more likely to want to be a guest on your show. So that's a massive thing. The question is it worth it for you? Well, it depends on your goals with your podcast. If you're doing it as a fun thing, then it may not be worth your time because you should be investing your time in something else that perhaps makes more money for you. If this is something that you are really serious about, then I would invest in it because it does take time and it is an investment, but it's massively paying off for us now. This year, our podcast has reached the top 10% of Spotify podcasts in the world. Like, this is nuts. And as a result, we're getting in clients, we're getting more membership for our members club. I'm getting more guests applying, I'm getting sponsors requesting things. And this would never have happened if it was still on Zoom or it was an audio only podcast. That's what I believe anyway. So I think that for me, I've seen a return on investment, but not everyone will. And don't get me wrong, it's been very stressful this year to try and get the podcast up and running and edited and done every single week because it's so much work, but it is totally worth it if you're staying consistent with it and you do believe in the longevity of your podcast. But you really have to think about these things. It's not just the initial cost of the equipment, it's the cost of your time and everything else. There are a few more things that you need to think about when you're having a video podcast as well, and you do need to prepare for a few more things. For example, having your guests and know that it's a video podcast. Some people turn up and they don't even realise, even though you send emails and be very clear about it. You need to let people know it's a video podcast. Not everyone's going to be comfortable being filmed as well. So this is the thing. Lots of people don't mind going on audio, but they don't like being filmed. So they may not even be as good. So you need to also prepare your guests for the confidence on the camera and also not necessarily looking into it and stiffening up. So there's a lot of that process. Otherwise, you're going to have to pick people who are used to doing that. I think also, if you think about it, even if you're doing it just yourself, even if you're just doing a solo podcast, you need to think about the fact that you probably can't use a script. You can't script it so perfectly that you can just read word for word. Some people do this with an audio podcast. They just have a script, they write it out and they just read it. And no one will know, because if you do it in a performative matter, no one will actually notice. Now, lots of people I know use teleprompters for videos and they have it behind the camera and they just read from it. And some people absolutely swear by it and they absolutely love it. I think you can tell. I think it hinders the natural flow and I don't think it works very well. For a solo podcast, this may be an option, but for an interview podcast, this is absolutely not an option. So I think there's something that you have to think about there. Then you have to think about all the things that can go wrong with a video podcast. And oh my God, so many things have gone wrong this year and it's been a nightmare and super stressful. I've actually left a lot of those things in the podcast so you can see it raw. After all, it's called No Bullshit Talks. I feel like it's showing the real kind of what it's really like filming a podcast. So, for example, I've had people walking into the room while I'm filming and, I left that in there. Sure, I could cut that out, but it disrupted the flow, so it wasn't as easy to do so. Whereas with audio only, you wouldn't have heard that. You could cut that out. I've had, it's more specific to actually video stuff, I would say that we've had, for example, the battery overheating on the camera because we're recording in 4K and each of the episodes are like an hour long. So the cameras are overheating and they just turn themselves off. And because I'm recording all of this myself, I don't have an assistant in the room. I don't even know the cameras are turning off. So I've lost 25 minutes of footage because I'm not even paying attention and I don't know and I have to check on the cameras every few minutes. I'm deep in conversation being the host. And I've even done things to stop that. For example, if you want to do that, you need to get a dummy battery, one that's plugged in, and then you could plug it into your camera and so it doesn't overheat as often. However, mine still overheat. So that was an issue. And then there was memory cards. Oh my God, the amount of problems I had with the memory cards. They were like wrong format, the footage wasn't recording onto them, they'd be corrupted, they'd run out of space. Like, even though I cleaned it out, I don't know what was going on, but these memory cards just messed up all the time. And then one minute, it wasn't compatible with the camera. And I was like, I've recorded 4 other episodes on this. How is it suddenly not compatible? There was always tech that's going wrong. So have spare memory cards all the time because I have had a nightmare with it. In fact, one episode, I had 3 memory cards all go wrong, and I was like, that's all my spare ones. But luckily, I was videoing a content creator. It was actually Jide Maduake, and he's a YouTuber, and so he was like, oh, I've got a spare memory card. I was like, oh my God. But that is rare, that could have happened. So many things can go wrong. Oh, then there's the lighting. So it's like I was trying to film roughly at the same time each day, so the daylight would be roughly the same, but sometimes the sun will go up, sun will go down, then it will change the lighting in the room, and so in the editing process, you're gonna have to adapt for that, but it's really difficult with video. Again, not relevant with audio. But then the audio is another thing when it comes to video, because sometimes the audio didn't sync up properly and there'd be those issues. And yeah, there's background noise that gets picked up from the microphone. So many things that can go wrong when you're videoing, and there's a lot of it. So you need to be aware of these issues and make sure you do know how to handle them, and you have someone that you can trust in place to help you with those things. But as I said, I do think that video podcasts are so much more effective than audio-only podcasts. So the question is, has it been worth it? So here are some of the benefits that I have experienced this year from my video podcast. Well, first of all, I don't have any problems with guests coming on the show. We are bombarded for applications of people coming on the show. When I reach out to people, most people say yes. And they are willing to come on the show because they get really high quality assets to use on their own social media. Now think about it. If you're creating content, it takes ages to actually create that content and, be able to edit it nicely. They're gonna have 10 to 20 free snippets that they can create from that podcast of really high quality content. That could potentially be like weeks of content that they're just having for free, or for an hour of their time to turn up and have an interesting conversation. And so it's in their benefit, but they wouldn't have that if it was an audio only podcast. So for me, I love that. And think about it then. If those people are then sharing those assets on their social media platform, you are massively amplifying your reach via their social media following too. And that's how you get noticed and recognized. Now, this is where you could also add a bit of leverage when it comes to brand deals, because sponsors are more likely to sponsor a video podcast because it increases the reach. They can put their logo on it. It's much more visual and it reaches way more people because you've got more platforms. For example, you could put it on YouTube, you could put it on TikTok, you could put it on Instagram, you could put it on LinkedIn, you could put it everywhere. Audio, yes, there are hacks away around this, but so you can create audiograms and use waveforms to trick the algorithm to thinking it's a video, or you could use stock footage over the top of it, absolutely, but it's still never going to be the same effect. So for me, I do think a video podcast is totally worth it in 2025 if you are in it for the long run, if this is a solid part of your business strategy for years to come. Do not embark in a video podcast if you are looking for instant results. It's just not going to happen. You will get stressed, you will be overworked and overwhelmed, and you won't see the results that you want. So how would you get set up now? I would say that if you think this is the right option for you, then go research your equipment. Have a think about what sort of budget you want to do. Make sure you carve out time in your week where you are going to be recording these podcasts, editing these podcasts, spending time marketing these podcasts, and make sure you do genuinely have enough time in the week to be able to commit to this, because it is going to be a commitment. Think about the type of content your audience digests as well, and make sure you're creating content around that. Not just stuff that you want to do, but put your stuff out there and also see what platforms that your content does really well on, and make sure you're spending the time researching it and investing in it, because it's going to be a long old journey, but I do think it's worth it. So I hope you found this video useful. I will do another video going into more details about the equipment, and please do leave some suggestions of anything else that you want to know about video podcasting in 2025.